bread, rice, potatoes. If you have been diagnosed with diabetes or prediabetes, there's a good chance someone has told you to avoid these foods. And on the surface, that advice sounds reasonable. These are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates raise blood sugar, so avoid the carbohydrates. But here is the problem with that advice. Bread, rice, and potatoes are not exotic foods that a small group of people eat occasionally. They are the foundational staples of nearly every cuisine on Earth. They are what billions of people have built their daily meals around for generations. Telling someone with diabetes to simply eliminate these foods is not just difficult advice to follow. For most people, it is completely unrealistic long-term, and advice that cannot be sustained long-term does not help anyone. Here is what I want to tell you instead. You do not have to give up these foods. What you need to understand is how to prepare them, combine them, sequence them, and time them in ways that fundamentally change how your body processes them. The same food, handled differently, produces a completely different blood sugar response. And once you understand the mechanisms behind that, you have real tools you can use every single day without turning your entire life upside down. My name is Dr. Kenji Sato. I am a preventive medicine physician and longevity researcher with decades of clinical practice. I have worked with thousands of patients managing type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, and what I consistently find is that the patients who do best long-term are not the ones who follow the most restrictive protocols. They are the ones who understand the underlying biology well enough to make smart, sustainable choices within a normal life. That is what today is about. Before we go further, I want to be clear about something important. Everything I am sharing today is based on peer-reviewed research and represents general educational information. I am not your physician. Please discuss any changes to your diet or your medical regimen with your own doctor before implementing them, particularly if you are on insulin or blood sugar-lowering medications, as the strategies I'm about to describe can meaningfully lower your post-meal glucose, and your medication doses may need adjustment. Now, let us get into the science, and let us start with what I consider one of the most powerful and most underutilized tools available for managing blood sugar. Something that most people with diabetes have never heard of: resistant starch. To understand resistant starch, you first need to understand what normally happens when you eat a standard starchy food. When you eat white bread, regular pasta, or freshly cooked white rice, the starch in those foods is rapidly broken down by digestive enzymes in your small intestine into individual glucose molecules. Those glucose molecules flood into your bloodstream quickly, producing a sharp rise in blood sugar. Your pancreas responds by releasing insulin to clear the glucose. If your insulin response is sluggish or your cells are resistant to insulin signal, that glucose spike stays elevated longer than it should, and repeated cycles of high post-meal glucose spikes are exactly what accelerates insulin resistance, stresses the pancreatic beta cells that produce insulin, and drives the progressive worsening of diabetes over time. Resistant starch behaves completely differently. As the name tells you, it resists digestion. Your small intestinal enzymes cannot break it down efficiently. So instead of being converted to glucose and absorbed in the blunt small intestine, resistant starch travels largely intact to your large intestine. There, your gut bacteria ferment it, and the products of that fermentation are short-chain fatty acids, including a compound called butyrate. Butyrate does several things that are directly relevant to blood sugar control. It directly improves insulin sensitivity in peripheral tissues, meaning your muscle cells and liver cells become more responsive to insulin signal to take up glucose. It reduces systemic inflammation, which is one of the primary drivers of insulin resistance, and it nourishes the cells lining your colon, supporting gut barrier integrity and reducing the intestinal permeability that contributes to metabolic dysfunction. So, resistant starch is not just a carbohydrate that raises your blood sugar less. It is actively improving the underlying metabolic problem that makes blood sugar control difficult in the first place. Now here is where it gets practically very interesting. You can significantly increase the resistant starch content of the foods you are already eating without changing what you eat. You just change how you prepare it. When you cook a starchy food like rice, pasta, or potatoes, and then cool it down, part of the starch undergoes a process called retrogradation. The starch molecules, which were loosened and gelatinized by the heat of cooking, realign into tight crystalline structures as they cool. These crystalline structures are what your digestive enzymes cannot efficiently break down. The starch has been physically transformed into a form that behaves more like fiber than like rapidly digestible starch. Multiple studies have confirmed this effect. Cooling cooked rice or potatoes to refrigerator temperature, around 4 degrees Celsius, for 24 hours significantly increases their resistant starch content compared to freshly cooked versions. And importantly, when you reheat the cooled food, a meaningful portion of that resistant starch is preserved. The retrogradation is not fully reversed by reheating, so you get food that tastes very close to what you are used to, eating with a substantially different metabolic impact. The clinical evidence supports this. Studies show that eating cooled and then reheated rice or potatoes, compared to freshly cooked versions, produces measurably lower post-meal blood sugar spikes and lower insulin responses. This is the same food, the same portion size, prepared one way versus another, and the blood sugar curve looks meaningfully different. If you eat rice regularly, cook a larger batch, refrigerate it overnight, and reheat it when you are ready to eat. If you eat potatoes, the same principle applies. Even bread that has been frozen and then toasted has a higher resistant starch content than fresh bread. These are not dramatic changes to your routine. They are small preparation habits with real metabolic consequences. Beyond the cooking and cooling strategy, there are foods that are naturally rich in resistant starch that you can incorporate into your meals directly. Legumes are the most concentrated natural source. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas all contain high amounts of resistant starch, along with soluble fiber that further slows glucose absorption. Whole oats, particularly steel-cut oats, rather than instant oats, also contain meaningful resistant starch. Slightly underripe bananas, which have a firmer texture than fully ripe ones, contain significantly more resistant starch than their fully ripened counterparts. As the ripening process converts resistant starch to readily digestible sugars. The second major strategy is food pairing, and this is one of the most clinically impactful things you can do without changing what you eat, only what you eat it with. Carbohydrates eaten in isolation produce the sharpest blood sugar responses. When you eat a starchy food alongside protein, fat, fiber, or acid, you fundamentally change how quickly that starch is broken down and how quickly the resulting glucose enters your bloodstream. The evidence for protein pairing is particularly strong. A meta-analysis of 154 controlled trials found that adding protein to a carbohydrate-containing meal reduced the glucose area under the curve by up to 50% in healthy adults. That is not a modest effect. Cutting the blood sugar impact of a meal in half simply by including a protein source alongside the carbohydrate. The mechanism is partly through the stimulation of GLP-1, the same hormone targeted by some of the newer diabetes medications, which slows gastric emptying and smooths the delivery of glucose into the bloodstream. Dietary fats similarly blunts post-meal glucose spikes. Fat slows the rate at which food leaves the stomach, extending the time over which glucose is absorbed and reducing the sharpness of the peak. This is the biological reason why rice and beans is metabolically superior to rice alone. Why potatoes with olive oil or butter produce a gentler glucose curve than plain potatoes. The fat and protein are changing the kinetics of glucose absorption in ways that matter clinically. Adding an acidic component to meals is another practical tool with solid evidence. Vinegar, lemon juice, or lime juice, consumed with or before a starchy meal, reduces the rate at which starch is broken down by digestive enzymes. Acetic acid in vinegar also improves insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue and can directly blunt glucose production by the liver through its effect on hepatic gluconeogenesis. Even fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, or miso, which contain organic acids from fermentation, exert a similar effect and additionally support the gut microbiome that plays a role in long-term metabolic health. The third strategy is food sequencing, and this is one of the most powerful tools available for managing post-meal blood sugar, yet it requires no change to what you eat, only the order in which you eat it. When you begin a meal with bread, rice, or any rapidly digestible carbohydrate, the starch hits your digestive system immediately with nothing to slow it down. The glucose spike begins within minutes and peaks sharply. But when you eat protein and vegetables first and save the starchy carbohydrate for the end of the meal, the protein and fiber you have already consumed slow the rate at which the stomach empties its contents into the small intestine. The glucose from the starch is released into a digestive environment where gastric emptying is already slowed. It enters the bloodstream gradually, rather than in a surge. A randomized, controlled crossover trial demonstrated this effect with specific numbers. People with type 2 diabetes who ate their protein and vegetables before their carbohydrates had a 40% lower glucose area under the curve compared to when they ate the same foods in the opposite order. 40% and their insulin response was 31% lower. This is the same meal, identical food, identical portions eaten in a different sequence, and the metabolic outcome is dramatically different. A study conducted in Japan using continuous glucose monitors in healthy adults confirmed the same pattern. Eating rice at the end of the meal rather than the beginning significantly reduced post-meal blood sugar excursions. The practical application is straightforward. When you sit down to a meal, start with your salad, your vegetables, or your protein. Eat those first, then move to your starchy component. If you are at a restaurant that brings bread before the meal arrives, let the bread sit and start with your water, your salad, or any vegetables while you wait for your main course. This single behavioral change, requiring no change to what you order or how much you eat, can meaningfully flatten your post-meal glucose curve at every meal. The fourth strategy is post-meal movement, and the research on this is consistently impressive for how large an effect such a small behavioral change produces. A randomized controlled trial showed that just a 10-minute walk taken immediately after a meal produces a meaningful reduction in post-meal blood glucose compared to sitting. 10 minutes. Not a gym session, not a structured workout. A 10-minute walk around the block or even within your home. The mechanism is specific and well understood. When you walk, you activate your soleus muscle. The soleus is the deeper of the two calf muscles, running from just below the knee down to the heel. And the soleus has a metabolic profile that is unique among skeletal muscles. It is composed predominantly of slow-twitch muscle fibers, which are extraordinarily efficient at sustained, low-intensity contraction. This means the soleus can remain active for extended periods without fatiguing. And because skeletal muscle contraction during movement takes up glucose from the bloodstream through an insulin-independent pathway, the soleus essentially functions as a glucose sponge that works regardless of your level of insulin resistance. The timing matters significantly. The earlier you walk after eating, the more effectively you intercept the glucose rise before it peaks. The ideal window is within 15 to 30 minutes of finishing your meal. If walking is not practical, any light movement helps. Standing and cleaning the kitchen, climbing a flight of stairs, light household activity. Walking has been the most studied and appears to be the most effective, but the fundamental principle is that any muscular activity in the post-meal window engages this insulin-independent glucose clearance mechanism. The fifth strategy involves carbohydrate quality, and I want to address this clearly because there is a significant difference between recommending a low-carbohydrate diet and recommending smarter carbohydrate choices. The problem is not carbohydrates as a category. The problem is how modern food processing has changed the physical structure of carbohydrates in ways that make them absorb drastically faster than whole food carbohydrate sources do. Think about what happens to wheat when it is milled into fine white flour. The grain is ground into particles so small that your digestive enzymes can access virtually the entire surface area simultaneously. The starch breaks down almost instantly. White bread, white pasta, crackers, pastries, breakfast cereals, and instant oatmeal all share this characteristic. They are made from finely processed starches that digest and absorb at rates that overwhelm your body's glucose management capacity if that capacity is already compromised. Now, compare that to steel-cut oats, intact whole grains like barley or farro, or legumes. These foods have not had their physical structure disrupted by the milling. Digestive enzymes have to work through intact cell walls and fibrous matrices to access the starch inside. The process is slow. Glucose enters the bloodstream gradually. The blood sugar curve is flatter, the insulin response is smaller, and the sustained satiety is greater. This is the kindling versus logs analogy that explains so much of what drives the blood sugar problems associated with modern diets. Fine flour is sawdust thrown on a fire. It burns instantly and intensely. Intact whole grains and legumes are logs. They release their energy slowly and steadily. The metabolic consequence of that difference, meal after meal, day after day, is enormous. When you are choosing carbohydrate sources, look for foods where you can see the whole grain structure. Steel cut, or rolled oats rather than instant. Brown rice or cooled white rice rather than freshly cooked white rice. Whole grain bread that is dense and chewy with visible grain texture rather than soft and fluffy commercial bread that is essentially fine flour with added color. Legumes at every opportunity. These choices do not require eliminating carbohydrates. They require shifting toward carbohydrates whose physical structure works with your metabolic system rather than overwhelming it. And fiber deserves specific emphasis here because it is the component of carbohydrate-containing foods that does the most metabolic work. Soluble fiber, found in oats, legumes, and many vegetables, forms a gel-like matrix in the intestine that physically slows the diffusion of glucose to the intestinal wall. Insoluble fiber adds bulk and supports gut motility. Both forms support the gut microbiome that produces the short-chain fatty acids, improving insulin sensitivity. If you are reducing your carbohydrate intake for blood sugar management, fiber should be the last thing you cut. It is the most metabolically valuable component of your carbohydrate-containing foods and the one whose absence most undermines your long-term metabolic health. The sixth strategy is meal timing, and specifically, the timing of your last meal relative to sleep. The research on this is consistent, and the mechanism is well established. Your body's ability to process glucose follows a clear circadian rhythm. Insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning and declines progressively through the day. By the evening hours, your pancreatic beta cells are less responsive. Your tissues are less insulin sensitive, and the same meal that would produce a moderate glucose response at noon produces a significantly larger response at 9 o'clock in the evening. There is a specific hormonal mechanism that amplifies this problem. In the hours before sleep, your body produces elevated levels of melatonin, the hormone that signals the onset of the sleep phase. Melatonin receptors are present on pancreatic beta cells, and melatonin directly suppresses insulin secretion through those receptors. So, in the late evening window, when insulin sensitivity is already at its lowest point in the circadian cycle, Rising melatonin is simultaneously reducing your pancreas's ability to produce insulin. The result is that eating a carbohydrate-containing meal close to bedtime is metabolically the worst possible timing. Less insulin available, tissues less responsive to what insulin is produced. The glucose has nowhere to go efficiently and stays elevated far longer than it would from the same meal eaten earlier in the day. Eating your last meal of the day at least 3 hours before your typical bedtime significantly reduces this effect. The earlier your dinner, the better your overnight glucose profile, and the lower your fasting blood sugar the following morning will tend to be. If you currently eat dinner late due to work or family schedule, this is one of the highest impact timing changes you can make for your blood sugar management. Let me bring everything together for you now. You do not have to give up bread, rice, or potatoes. What you need to do is apply a set of specific evidence-based strategies that change how your body processes those foods. Cook your starchy foods, cool them overnight in the refrigerator, and reheat before eating to increase their resistant starch content and reduce the glycemic response. Pair your carbohydrates with protein, healthy fat, and fiber at every meal, rather than eating starch alone. Add an acidic component like vinegar, lemon, or lime to your meals to slow starch digestion and improve insulin sensitivity. Eat your protein and vegetables first and save the starchy component for the end of the meal to reduce your post-meal glucose curve by up to 40%. Take a 10-minute walk within 30 minutes of finishing your meal to activate insulin-independent glucose clearance through your soleus muscle. Choose carbohydrates made from whole, minimally processed grains and legumes, rather than fine flour products that digest almost instantly. And eat your last meal of the day at least 3 hours before bedtime to align your food intake with your body's circadian insulin sensitivity rhythm. None of these strategies requires you to give up the foods that anchor your daily meals. They require you to understand the biology well enough to work with your body rather than against it. Your body is capable of significantly better blood sugar control than your current numbers may suggest. It has not failed. It has been working with incomplete information and suboptimal inputs. Give it the right inputs applied consistently and correctly, and the response often begins faster than most people expect. I am Dr. Kenji Sato. If this gave you practical tools that your clinical appointments have not had time to explain, subscribe and share this with someone managing diabetes who has been told only what they cannot eat without being told how to eat what they love more intelligently. I will see you in the next one.